He loosened his tie as he entered, his expression already fixed in that familiar, controlled calm. "You left early today," he noted. Victoria nodded. "I needed space." Julian glanced at her briefly. "From what?" She hesitated. Then, "From everything." Julian exhaled lightly, as if the answer required no further exploration. "You've been distracted," he said. Victoria crossed her arms. "Have I?" "Yes." "And that bothers you?" Julian met her gaze. "I prefer clarity." Victoria let out a quiet laugh. "Clarity isn't always convenient." "No," Julian replied evenly. "But it's necessary." A pause. Then, "Are you unhappy?" he asked. The question hung in the air, direct, unexpected. Victoria blinked. "I know," she said quickly. Too quickly. Julian noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything, except what mattered. "Then what is it?" he pressed. Victoria looked at him. Really looked. And suddenly, she didn't know how to answer. Because the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't something she could package into a sentence. It was a feeling, a slow, creeping realization that something fundamental was missing. "I thought this was what I wanted," she said finally. Julian's expression didn't change, and now Victoria hesitated. "I don't know." That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. Julian straightened slightly, his tone cooling. "Uncertainty isn't productive, Victoria." She frowned. "I'm not a business deal." "No," he said. "But you made a decision, and decisions have outcomes." Victoria's voice sharpened. "So this is just an outcome to you?" Julian held her gaze. "Everything is." The words settled between them, heavy, unavoidable. That night, Victoria stood alone on the balcony, the city stretching endlessly beneath her. Her phone was in her hand, unlocked, waiting. She didn't know why. She didn't know what she expected. But her thumb hovered over Ethan's name. She hadn't spoken to him since the gala, hadn't tried, hadn't allowed herself to, because reaching out would mean acknowledging something she wasn't ready to face. But now, after everything, after seeing him, hearing about him, feeling the quiet distance between herself and the life she had chosen, the silence felt louder than ever. She stared at the screen, at his name, at the space between what was and what could have been. Then slowly she locked the phone, set it down, and stepped back. Because deep down she already knew the truth. It wasn't just that Ethan had changed, it was that he had become someone she could no longer reach. And for the first time, Victoria Hale began to understand the weight of her own choice. Not as a mistake, not yet, but as something irreversible. The invitation arrived without ceremony, a black envelope, thick paper, minimal text, another gala, another stage, another carefully constructed night where appearances would matter more than truth. Ethan almost declined. He stood in the quiet of his New York apartment, the city glowing faintly beyond the glass, the invitation resting untouched on the table. He didn't need to go. There was nothing left for him there, nothing unresolved, nothing unfinished. "You're thinking about it." Isabella's voice was soft but certain. Ethan didn't turn immediately. "It's just another event." "No," she said gently. "It isn't." He glanced at her. She stood by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, watching him, not with curiosity, but with understanding. "You don't have to prove anything," she added. "I'm not trying to." "Then why go?" The question lingered. Not because Ethan didn't have an answer, but because he didn't want to examine it too closely. After a moment he exhaled quietly. "Because avoiding it feels unnecessary." Isabella studied him for a second, then nodded. "All right, no pressure, no doubt, just trust." That was the difference. She didn't ask him to confront the past. She trusted that if he did, it would be by choice. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. The kind of evening where the air sharpened everything light sound presence. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks in silence, his movements precise, unhurried. Isabella stepped beside him, her dress simple, elegant, effortless. "Ready?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes. Yes. And this time he meant it. The venue was brighter than the last, larger, more crowded, more watchful. Because now, his return was no longer a surprise. It was a narrative. Ethan Caldwell had come back, and people were paying attention. Victoria arrived earlier than expected. She hadn't planned to, but staying home felt worse. Julian stood beside her, engaged in conversation, his presence commanding as always. But tonight, it didn't anchor her the way it used to. She felt it before she saw him. That same shift. Subtle, immediate, unavoidable. Ethan entered the room, and just like before, everything adjusted. But this time, it wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Victoria turned. Their eyes met almost instantly. No distance, no delay. And something inside her gave way. Julian followed her gaze, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "He's early," he said. Victoria didn't respond. Because she wasn't looking at Julian, she was looking at Ethan. And this time, she didn't look away. Across the room, Ethan felt it. Not tension, not discomfort, just awareness. He turned to Isabella. "I'll be back." She held his gaze for a moment. "Take your time," she said. No questions, no hesitation. That more than anything grounded him. Ethan moved through the room with quiet certainty, each step deliberate, each movement controlled, until finally he stood in front of her. Victoria Hale. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because words felt insufficient. "You look well," Victoria said first. Her voice was steady, but softer than before. Ethan nodded slightly. "I am." A pause. "You're back," she added. "Yes." Permanently. Ethan considered the question. Then no. That answer did something to her, subtle, but visible. Victoria let out a quiet breath. Of course. Silence settled between them. Not empty, not awkward, but heavy with everything that had never been said. "I didn't expect to see you again," she admitted. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I didn't expect to come back." "Then why did you—" He met her gaze. "Because I can." That was the difference. He wasn't here for her. He wasn't here for the past. He was here because it no longer controlled him. Victoria swallowed slowly. "I heard about your work," she said. "People are impressed." Ethan didn't react. People are easily impressed. She almost smiled. Almost. Another pause. "Then I'm glad you're doing well." The words were sincere, but incomplete. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Thank you." Victoria hesitated, and then she stepped closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough to shift the space between them. "I made a mistake." His tone was neutral, but his eyes were not. "They said he disappeared," Victoria murmured. Julian exhaled softly. "Looks like he found something worth returning for." Victoria didn't respond, because she couldn't stop looking. Ethan felt it before he saw her. Not instinct, recognition. Some connections didn't disappear, they just waited. He turned slightly. And there she was, Victoria Hale, exactly where he expected her to be. For a moment, time didn't freeze. It clarified. She looked beautiful. Of course she did. Victoria had always understood presentation, how to exist within a space in a way that invited admiration. But now, there was something else beneath it. Something less certain. Their eyes met. No shock, no visible reaction, just awareness. Isabella noticed the shift, not in the room, but in Ethan, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present. "Someone you know?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't look away from Victoria. "Yes." A pause. "Someone I used to." That was enough. Isabella followed his gaze, and immediately understood. Not the details, but the significance. Across the room, Victoria felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not jealousy, not anger, but imbalance. Because this wasn't how the story was supposed to unfold. Ethan wasn't supposed to return like this. He wasn't supposed to look complete. Julian stepped forward slightly. "Let's say hello." Victoria hesitated, only for a second, then nodded. The distance between them closed slowly. Measured steps, controlled expressions. 4 people, each carrying a different version of the same past. Ethan Julian said smoothly, extending a hand. "Didn't expect to see you back in New York." Ethan looked at him, then shook his hand. "Neither did I." Julian smiled faintly. "I hope Europe treated you well." It did what it needed to. A subtle answer, carefully chosen. Julian turned slightly. "Victoria, you remember Ethan?" A statement, not a question. Victoria met Ethan's eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "I do." Her voice didn't break, but something beneath it almost did. "And this is—" Julian gestured toward Isabella. Ethan didn't hesitate. "My wife," he said. The word landed cleanly, without emphasis, without performance. But its impact was immediate. Victoria's breath caught, just barely, but enough. Isabella extended her hand gracefully. "Isabella Laurent." Victoria shook it, her smile precise. "Victoria Hale." Their eyes met, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them. Unspoken, measured, understood. "It's nice to meet you," Isabella said. Victoria nodded. "You too." But her gaze lingered, not on Isabella's face, but on the space between her and Ethan. The ease, the quiet alignment, something that couldn't be faked. Julian broke the moment. "Well, we won't keep you. Enjoy the evening." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "You too." And just like that, they parted, but nothing felt resolved. Later that night, Victoria stood alone near the balcony, the city stretching endlessly before her. The noise of the gala faded behind her, replaced by something quieter, more intrusive. She replayed the moment again and again. Not what was said, but what wasn't. Ethan hadn't looked angry, hadn't looked hurt, hadn't looked like a man who had lost anything. He looked like someone who had moved on, completely. Behind her, Julian's voice cut through the silence. "You're thinking about him." Victoria didn't turn. "No." Julian stepped closer. "You are." She exhaled slowly. "It's just unexpected." Julian's expression hardened slightly. "People like him don't usually come back stronger." Victoria finally turned. "And people like you?" she asked quietly. Julian held her gaze. "They don't lose." But for the first time, Victoria wasn't sure that was true. Across the room, Ethan stood beside Isabella, watching the city through the glass. "Are you all right?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes." And this time, it wasn't a lie. Because the past had finally caught up to him. And instead of pulling him back, it confirmed something he had already learned. He no longer belonged to it. The night of the gala didn't end when the lights dimmed. It lingered, in silence, in thought, in the quiet spaces people couldn't escape. Victoria didn't sleep. She lay awake in Julian's penthouse, staring at the ceiling, while the city pulsed faintly beyond the glass walls. Beside her, Julian slept soundly, steady, undisturbed, as if nothing in the world had shifted. But everything had. Not externally, not visibly, but internally. Something had fractured. Ethan's face replayed in her mind. Not the man she remembered, but the one she saw. Composed, unaffected, whole, and worst of all, unreachable. Victoria turned onto her side, her gaze settling on Julian. For the first time in a long time, she really looked at him. The sharp lines of his face, the confidence even in rest, the subtle tension that never quite left his expression. He was everything she had once believed she needed. Stability, power, certainty. So why did it suddenly feel so hollow? Morning came too quickly. Julian was already dressed by the time Victoria stepped into the kitchen, his phone pressed between his ear and shoulder as he scanned through emails. "Yes, Move the meeting to Thursday, he said. His tone clipped. No, I don't care what they prefer. Make it work. He ended the call without acknowledgement, placing the phone down with quiet precision. You're up, he said, glancing at her briefly. Victoria poured herself coffee. Couldn't sleep. Julian nodded, distracted. You should take something for that. She paused. That's your solution. It's practical. Victoria let out a small, humorless breath. Of course it is. Julian didn't respond. He rarely did when conversations drifted into anything undefined. They moved around each other in silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, just disconnected. Later that afternoon, Victoria sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, her phone resting untouched in front of her. She had opened Ethan's profile, not intentionally, at least that's what she told herself. But there it was, minimal, private, almost empty, no curated life, no visible narrative, just a name, and a single photo taken months ago, likely at a business event. He stood beside Isabella, not posed, not staged, just present, and somehow, that said more than anything else. He looks different. The voice pulled her from her thoughts. Victoria looked up. Clara Whitmore slid into the seat across from her, setting her sunglasses aside. You saw him too, right? Clara continued. At the gala. Victoria nodded slowly. Yes. Clara leaned forward slightly. People are talking. I'm sure they are. They're saying he's worth more now than Julian. Victoria stilled. The words weren't loud, but they landed, hard. Clara tilted her head. Does that surprise you? Victoria forced a faint smile. Why would it? Clara studied her for a moment. Then quietly, because you didn't choose him. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Victoria looked away first. I made my decision, she said. Clara didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. That evening, Victoria returned home earlier than usual. The penthouse felt colder than it should have. Too clean. Too perfect. She walked through it slowly, her heels echoing against the marble floors. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a place she belonged. It felt like a place she occupied. Julian arrived an hour later. Ethan nodded once. I do. She didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't over-explain, didn't try to impress him. That alone made her different. The meeting was efficient, but not forgettable. Isabella didn't just present numbers, she understood them. More importantly, she understood the implications behind them. When she disagreed, she said so calmly, without hesitation, without softening her perspective to accommodate his authority. At one point, Ethan looked up from the document, studying her. You're not trying to win me over, he observed. Isabella met his gaze. I'm trying to be accurate. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, whether that wins you over is your decision. Ethan didn't smile, but something shifted. After that, their paths crossed again. And again. At first, it was purely professional. Shared projects, brief conversations, mutual respect. But there was an undercurrent neither of them acknowledged. Not attraction, not immediately. Recognition. Isabella noticed things others didn't. The way Ethan never spoke about his past. The way he avoided personal questions without appearing evasive. The way his composure wasn't natural, it was constructed. Carefully, deliberately. One evening, after a long meeting that stretched into dusk, they found themselves walking along the river. The city lights reflected against the water, distorted but steady. You don't trust easily, Isabella said, not as a question. Ethan glanced at her. I trust what's consistent, and people aren't, not reliably. She considered that. And yet you build your entire business on long-term investments. That's different. Why? Ethan paused. Because assets didn't leave, didn't change their minds, didn't rewrite history. But he didn't say that. Instead, he replied, because numbers don't pretend. Isabella nodded slowly. That's not entirely true, she said. Numbers can be manipulated, interpreted, framed. Ethan looked at her again. And people. She met his gaze steady. People are honest, she said, when they stopped trying to be anything else. That stayed with him. Long after the conversation ended, their connection didn't happen quickly. There were no sudden confessions, no dramatic shifts, just time, shared space, gradual understanding. Isabella never pushed, never asked Ethan to explain himself, but she didn't accept distance as an answer either. She met it with presence, consistent, unwavering, and slowly Ethan began to respond. The first time he mentioned New York, it was accidental, a passing reference during a conversation about market trends, but Isabella noticed. "You lived there," she said. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "For a long time. And you left." Not a question, a statement. "Yes." "Why?" Ethan looked ahead, hands in his coat pockets. "For the same reason most people do," he said. "Because staying stopped making sense." Isabella didn't press further, but she understood. Not the details, but the weight behind them. Months turned into a year, and somewhere in that time, Ethan changed. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough. He spoke more, not about everything, but about something. He listened differently, less guarded, more present. And when he was with Isabella, he didn't feel the need to control the narrative. The night it shifted wasn't planned. It wasn't marked by a grand gesture or a defining moment. Just a quiet dinner, a small restaurant tucked away from the city's noise. Warm lighting, soft conversation, the kind of place that didn't try to impress. They sat across from each other, a comfortable silence settling between them. "You're different with me," Isabella said. Ethan didn't deny it. "I know." Why, he considered the question. "Because you don't ask me to be someone else. Because you don't admire me for the wrong reasons. Because you see what I don't say and don't use it against me." But what he said was simpler. "Because you don't need anything from me." Isabella held his gaze. "That's not true." Ethan stilled slightly. "No, I need honesty," she said. "But not the kind people perform, the kind they avoid." A pause. "And you?" Ethan asked. "What do you need?" Isabella smiled faintly. "The same thing she said, but I'm willing to wait for it." That was the difference. She didn't demand. She didn't chase. She stayed. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the need to disappear. Their relationship wasn't built on illusion. There were no perfect narratives, no curated images, no external validation. Just truth, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes incomplete, but always real. On a quiet morning in early spring, Ethan stood by the window of his London apartment watching the city wake beneath a pale sky. Behind him, Isabella moved through the space with quiet familiarity, pouring coffee, opening windows, letting light in. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. But it was steady. Ethan turned, watching her for a moment, then walked over. No hesitation, no calculation, just presence. "Stay," he said softly. Isabella looked at him. "I already am." And somewhere in a part of himself he had long abandoned. Ethan believed her. Reinvention didn't mean becoming someone new. It meant becoming someone honest, stripped of illusion, defined by choice. And for Ethan Caldwell, this time he chose differently. New York didn't change. It never did. It only evolved faster, louder, sharper. But beneath the glass towers and curated reinventions, it remained the same city that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the car like he had never left. But everything about him said otherwise. It was early evening when they arrived in Manhattan. The skyline glowed in gold and steel, familiar, yet distant, like a memory viewed through someone else's eyes. Beside him, Isabella Laurent adjusted her coat, her movements calm, unhurried. She didn't look impressed. She didn't look overwhelmed. She simply observed. "You used to live here," she said. Ethan nodded once. "A different version of me did." Isabella glanced at him, a faint knowing expression in her eyes. "I'm curious which one they'll see tonight." Ethan didn't answer, because he already knew. The invitation had been intentional. a high-profile charity gala hosted by the Harrington Foundation, one of the most visible social events of the season. The kind of place where reputations were displayed, alliances reinforced, and narratives quietly rewritten. Ethan hadn't attended events like this in years, not since before, but this time he chose to. When they entered the venue, the shift was immediate, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. Conversations faltered, eyes turned. Recognition spread slowly like a ripple no one could stop. "That's Caldwell, isn't it? I thought he left the country." "He did. Then what is he doing here? And then, who is she?" Isabella walked beside him with effortless composure. She didn't cling, didn't perform. Her presence wasn't loud, but it commanded attention in a way that didn't ask for it. She wore no excess, no need for spectacle, and somehow that made her impossible to ignore. Ethan moved through the room with quiet precision. He acknowledged people when necessary, accepted greetings without inviting conversation. His tone was polite, controlled, distant. No explanations, no justifications, no trace of the man they once pitied. Across the room, Victoria saw him. At first, she didn't recognize him. Not fully, because the man standing near the center of the room didn't carry the same weight, the same quiet restraint she remembered. This version of Ethan was different, sharper, more defined, as if the years had carved something out of him instead of wearing him down. And then her gaze shifted to the woman beside him, Isabella Laurent. Though Victoria didn't know her name yet, she felt her presence instantly. Not just beauty, though she had that undeniably, but something else, composure, depth, a kind of stillness that didn't compete with the room but surpassed it. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. Victoria Julian's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to him, her expression composed almost instantly. "Yes," Julian followed her gaze, and for a brief moment, even he paused. "That's unexpected," he said, not to explain, not to reclaim anything that had already been taken, but to leave, completely. Days later, Victoria stood on another rooftop, another event, another carefully curated moment. Someone raised a glass. To bold choices, they said. Laughter followed. Victoria smiled, lifting her champagne. But for a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Because somewhere deep beneath the applause and approval, there was a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask. Why doesn't it feel like winning? And somewhere else in the city, Ethan Caldwell was already preparing to disappear. Not dramatically, not visibly, but deliberately. Because the world could keep its version of the story. He no longer needed to be part of it. Ethan Caldwell didn't announce his departure. He didn't leave a message, didn't organize a farewell dinner, didn't offer anyone the comfort of closure. One morning, he was simply gone. At first, no one noticed. New York had a way of absorbing absence, without question. People traveled, disappeared into projects, re-emerged weeks later, with new deals and tired smiles. Ethan's silence in the beginning felt temporary, almost expected. Daniel sent a text. "You good? Haven't seen you in a few days." No response. A few more days passed. Another message. "Call me when you can." Still nothing. By the end of the second week, concern began to shift into curiosity. "He's probably just taking time off," someone said at the firm. "Yeah," another replied, lowering their voice slightly after everything that happened. Can you blame him? But there was something unsettling about the lack of trace. No social media activity, no email replies, no sightings at his usual places. It was as if Ethan Caldwell had stepped out of his life and forgotten to return. Victoria heard about it at a brunch in Soho. It wasn't even directed at her. He just vanished. One woman said casually, stirring her coffee. Didn't even wrap up his projects properly. "That's dramatic," someone else replied. Victoria's hand stilled around her glass. "What do you mean, vanished?" she asked, her tone light, too light. The table shifted slightly, attention turning. "No one's heard from him," the first woman explained. "Not his firm, not his friends. It's like he dropped off the map." Victoria forced a small smile. I'm sure he's fine, but something tightened in her chest. Not concern, not quite. Something more complicated. Because Ethan had never been dramatic, never impulsive. He was the kind of man who finished things, who stayed, who endured, and yet he had disappeared. That night, Victoria stood alone in Julian's penthouse, staring out at the city. The glass in her hand remained untouched. Behind her, the apartment was immaculate, sleek lines, curated art, the kind of space that felt more like a statement than a home. Julian was on a call in the next room, his voice low-controlled, discussing numbers and timelines, as if the world operated entirely on logic. Victoria barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere. He just vanished. The words echoed, not because she believed Ethan was incapable of it, but because she didn't understand it. And not understanding something about Ethan felt unfamiliar. She had always known him, or at least she thought she had. In reality, Ethan was no longer in New York. He hadn't been for days. The plane landed in Zurich just after sunrise. The sky was pale, the air crisp in a way that felt almost intrusive after the density of Manhattan. Everything here was quieter, more deliberate. Ethan stepped out of the airport with nothing but a carry-on, and a name that for the first time in years felt optional. No one was waiting for him. No one expected him. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that felt right. The apartment the firm arranged was minimal, clean, functional, impersonal, a temporary space for a temporary version of himself. Ethan set his bag down by the door and stood there for a moment listening. Silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of his New York apartment after Victoria left, but something lighter, neutral, untouched. He exhaled slowly, then moved. The days that followed were structured, deliberate. Ethan woke early, worked long hours, kept conversations professional, brief, and distant. The Zurich firm didn't ask questions about his past. They cared about results. And Ethan delivered. His designs were sharper now, more precise, stripped of unnecessary elements. There was no room for distraction, no space for memory. At least that's what he told himself. But memory had a way of resurfacing in the quiet moments, in the reflection of glass windows, in the pause between meetings, in the unfamiliar rhythm of a city that didn't know him. Sometimes it came in fragments. Victoria laughing on a Sunday morning, the way she used to reach for his hand absent-mindedly, the sound of her voice before it became distant. Ethan never lingered on those moments. He let them pass, like noise. Weeks turned into months, and slowly something began to shift, not in the world around him, but within him. The sharpness of the pain dulled. The constant awareness of absence faded. In its place, there was something else. Clarity. Not the kind that arrived all at once, but the kind that built quietly, layer by layer. Ethan began to see things differently. Not just what had happened, but how it had happened. The small signs he had ignored, the compromises he had made, the version of himself he had become in order to maintain something that was already breaking. He didn't blame Victoria, not entirely, because somewhere along the way, he had disappeared long before she ever left. Winter arrived in Zurich without ceremony. Snow settled over the city in soft, deliberate layers, muting the world even further. Ethan stood by the window of his apartment one evening, watching it fall. There was a stillness to it, a kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was reacting to something. He was simply existing. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. Ethan didn't turn immediately. It buzzed again and again, persistent. Reluctant, he walked over and glanced at the screen. Daniel. 3 missed calls. A message. Where the hell are you, people are asking. Victoria too. Ethan stared at the words for a moment, then locked the phone, set it face down, and walked away. Back in New York, the speculation had grown louder. Maybe he had a breakdown. I heard he left the country. No, someone said he's working remotely. Or hiding. Everyone had a version. None of them were correct. Victoria heard them all. She never corrected anyone. But she listened. Carefully. Because beneath the rumors, beneath the assumptions, there was something she couldn't quite name. Not regret, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something unresolved. Months later, she stood in front of a mirror adjusting an earring before another event. Julian appeared behind her, his reflection sharp and composed. "You ready?" he asked. Victoria met his eyes in the mirror. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she nodded. Yes, but as she turned away, her gaze lingered just briefly on her phone resting on the counter. Silent, empty. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. Ethan Caldwell had not reached out, not once. And somewhere thousands of miles away, he had no intention of ever doing so. Because this wasn't just distance, it was erasure, deliberate, complete. Ethan hadn't just left New York. He had left behind the man who once needed it. And he wasn't coming back, not yet. Time didn't heal Ethan Caldwell. It refined him. 3 years later, his name existed again, but differently. Not in architectural magazines or local firm directories, but in quiet financial circles that didn't advertise success, they recognized it. Ethan had transitioned from designing structures to acquiring them, reshaping city blocks, not with blueprints, but with capital and precision. Zurich had been the beginning. London became the evolution. He operated through a private investment group, rarely appearing in public, never giving interviews. His portfolio expanded across Europe. Commercial real estate boutique developments, strategic acquisitions that turned overlooked properties into high-value assets. People described him in fragments. Disciplined, unpredictable, difficult to read. No one used the word emotional. Ethan preferred it that way. His days were structured, his interactions measured. Conversations remained purposeful, relationships professional, efficient. Nothing extended beyond what was necessary. Nothing lingered. Until Isabella Laurent. They met without intention, not at a gala or curated event, but in a quiet conference room overlooking the Thames. It was raining that day, London's usual grey, steady and unremarkable. Ethan had arrived early for a meeting regarding a redevelopment project in South Bank. He stood by the window, reviewing documents on his tablet, barely noticing when the door opened. "Mr. Caldwell." The voice was calm, clear. He turned. She wasn't what he expected. Isabella Laurent stood, with quiet confidence, her presence composed, but not performative. Dark hair pulled back loosely, minimal makeup, eyes observant in a way that suggested she missed very little. "I was told you prefer to review the structural proposals personally," she said, stepping forward. "I'm representing the consulting firm." On the night, his wife left him for another man, Ethan. Caldwell didn't raise his voice, didn't break anything, didn't beg. He simply nodded, like a man signing off on his own disappearance. The apartment was too quiet for a Tuesday night. Ethan stood by the kitchen island, sleeves rolled up, a glass of untouched whiskey warming in his hand. Outside Manhattan pulsed with life horns, sirens, laughter echoing from somewhere far below. But inside, everything felt suspended, like time had chosen this moment to hesitate. Victoria stood across from him. Perfect, as always. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, her voice carefully measured, as if she had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. "I didn't want you to hear it from someone else," she said. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "Hear what?" A pause. Not long, just enough to make it hurt more. "I'm leaving you." There it was. No drama, no tears, no trembling voice, just a sentence. Ethan blinked once, processing not the words, but the absence of emotion behind them. For how long, he asked. Victoria looked at him, and for a second, just a second, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or hesitation. Then it vanished, for good. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent. Ethan set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the marble counter like it mattered. "And, is there someone else?" he asked, though he already knew. Victoria inhaled slowly. Yes, a beat. Julian Cross. The name landed differently, not like a knife but like a confirmation. Ethan nodded once. Of course, Julian Cross. The man who walked into rooms like he owned them. The man people gravitated toward. The man Ethan had once shaken hands with at a charity event, unaware that his life was already unraveling. How long, Ethan asked. Victoria hesitated again. 6 months. Ethan almost smiled. 6 months. Half a year of dinners, conversations, shared spaces, and he hadn't seen it. Or maybe he had and chose not to. That's efficient, he said quietly. Ethan. No, he interrupted gently. Don't explain it like it's complicated. It's not. Victoria's jaw tightened. It is complicated. It's really not, he replied. You met someone with more gravity, more reach, more what certainty. That's not fair. Ethan looked at her, then really looked at her. The woman he had built a life with. The woman who used to laugh at nothing, who used to fall asleep on the couch with her head on his shoulder. Now she looked like someone else entirely. It doesn't have to be fair, he said. It just has to be true. Silence stretched between them. Victoria crossed her arms, a subtle, defensive gesture. I didn't plan this. No one ever does. He understands me in ways you don't. That one landed. Not loudly, but deeply. Ethan nodded slowly. I'm sure he does. Another pause. I'm moving out this weekend, she added. Ethan leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. You already found a place. Victoria hesitated. I'm moving in with him. Of course you are. Ethan exhaled long and controlled. Does he know everything about you, he asked. Victoria frowned. What does that mean? I mean, Ethan said calmly. Does he know how you take your coffee? That you hate silence when you're anxious? That you pretend to be stronger than you feel? That's not fair. You said that already. Victoria looked away, her composure cracking just slightly. Why are you being like this? Like what? Cold. Ethan considered that. I think he said slowly, this is just what clarity looks like. That stung. He could see it in the way her shoulders tensed. I didn't want to hurt you, she said softer now. Ethan let out a quiet, almost humorless breath. That's the only part of this, I believe. Another silence. Heavy. Final. So that's it? Victoria asked. Ethan looked at her, at the woman who had just erased years of shared life with a handful of sentences. He nodded once. That's it. No shouting, no pleading, no scene. Just acceptance. And somehow that made it worse. Victoria picked up her bag from the chair. I'll come by later this week for the rest of my things. Ethan didn't respond. She lingered for a moment as if expecting something, anything. But Ethan had nothing left to give her. Not anger, not sadness, not even a goodbye. So she turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, the apartment felt different. Not empty, but hollow. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the door. Then slowly he reached for his glass again. The whiskey was warm now. Flat. He took a sip anyway. It burned, but not enough. Across the city, lights flickered in high-rise windows. Lives continued, stories unfolded. And somewhere in the distance, a man named Julian Cross was probably pouring champagne. Ethan closed his eyes, not in pain, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous, detachment. Because in that moment, without realizing it, Ethan Caldwell had already begun to disappear. By the end of the week, it wasn't a secret anymore. It was a narrative, not whispered in corners or exchanged in quiet concern, but displayed polished and shared. Like everything else in New York's upper circles, the truth had been repackaged into something more palatable, more admirable, more aspirational. Victoria Hale had not left her husband. She had chosen herself. That was the phrase. It appeared first in a caption beneath a photo posted on her Instagram, a black and white shot taken on a rooftop in Tribeca. She stood beside Julian Cross, her hand resting lightly against his chest, both of them dressed in understated luxury. The skyline stretched behind them like a promise. Growth requires difficult choices, grateful for new beginnings. Within hours, The comments flooded in. So proud of you. You deserve happiness. This is what courage looks like. Ethan stared at the image on his phone long enough for the screen to dim. Then he locked it, set it down, and didn't touch it again for the rest of the night. At first, the calls came from people who meant well. "Hey man, I heard," said Daniel from his firm, his voice too careful, too rehearsed. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, staring at the ceiling. "Yeah. You okay?" A pause. Not because Ethan didn't have an answer, but because none of them seemed appropriate. "I'm working," he said finally. Daniel exhaled softly. "If you need anything, I don't," Ethan replied, not unkindly. After a few more hollow exchanges, the call ended. It was the same conversation repeated in different voices. Concern disguised as curiosity, support laced with subtle judgment. Because beneath it all, there was a question no one asked directly. How did you lose her? At the firm, things shifted. Not overtly, not in a way anyone could point to, but Ethan felt it. In the way conversations paused when he entered a room. In the way colleagues offered sympathy without meeting his eyes. In the way his name was spoken more gently, as if it had become fragile. He was no longer just Ethan Caldwell, the architect, with precision and quiet confidence. He was Ethan Caldwell, the one whose wife left him. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria's life expanded. Julian didn't just introduce her to his world, he elevated her within it. Private dinners in penthouses overlooking Central Park, weekends in the Hamptons, charity galas where her name appeared beside his in bold print. Victoria adapted quickly, she always had. At an event hosted by the Harrington Foundation, she stood beside Julian in a sleek ivory gown, accepting compliments like she had always belonged there. "You're radiant," one woman said, sipping champagne. "Julian has impeccable taste." Victoria smiled. "Thank you." It was easier not to think about the implication. Nearby, Julian spoke with a group of investors, his hand occasionally brushing against the small of her back, a gesture that seemed intimate but felt calculated, possessive, not affectionate. But no one noticed that. Or maybe they did, and simply chose not to care. Because from the outside, everything looked perfect. Later that night, Victoria scrolled through her notifications in the back seat of Julian's car. More messages, more admiration, more validation. She should have felt something: triumph maybe, relief. Instead, there was a faint, persistent discomfort, like wearing something beautiful that didn't quite fit. Julian glanced at her from beside the window. "You've been quiet." "Just tired," she said. He nodded, accepting the answer without question. That was one of the things about Julian. He didn't ask for depth. He assumed alignment. Across town, Ethan sat alone in the apartment that no longer felt like his. Victoria had taken most of her things, but not all. A scarf draped over the back of a chair. A book on the nightstand folded at a page she would never finish. Traces, fragments, echoes of a life that had ended without ceremony. Ethan walked through the space slowly, as if expecting it to explain itself. But it didn't. It just existed. Quiet, unchanged, indifferent. He stopped by the window looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, people were celebrating her, admiring her, rewriting the story in a way that made sense to them. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the betrayal, not even the loss, but the distortion. The way something so personal, so devastating could be transformed into something admirable. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, clear, focused, detached. He reached for his phone, not to check messages, not to scroll, but to open his email. There was a message he had ignored for weeks. A proposal from a firm in Zurich. At the time, it had felt unnecessary. Now it felt like an exit. Ethan read it again, slower this time. Then, without overthinking, he replied, "I'm interested. Let's talk." He hit send. And just like that, something shifted. Not externally. The city still buzzed. The narrative still belonged to her. But internally, a quiet decision had been made. not to fight. The words came out quieter than she expected. But once they were there, she couldn't take them back. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. "We all do," he said. Victoria shook her head slightly. "No, I mean..." She stopped, recalibrated, tried again. "I thought I was choosing something better," she said. "Something stronger, more certain." Her voice wavered just slightly. "But I didn't realize what I was losing until it was already gone." Ethan listened, without interruption, without expression. "I told myself it was the right decision," she continued, "that I was moving forward. A breath. But seeing you again..." She stopped, because the rest of the sentence didn't need to be said. Ethan finished it for her. "It made you question that." Victoria met his eyes. Yes, there it was. The truth. Unfiltered. Unprotected. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan spoke. Quietly. Calmly. "I don't." Victoria blinked. The words didn't register at first. "I don't question it," he continued. "Not unkind. Not cold. Just certain." A subtle shift passed through her expression. Confusion. Then realization. "You don't regret it?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No." The answer was immediate, effortless, final. Victoria's breath caught. Not even a little. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, there was something softer in his expression. Not for her, but for the memory of who she used to be. "I regret who I was," he said. A pause, but not what happened. The distinction landed, harder than anything else he could have said. Victoria felt it, not as rejection, but as something deeper, something irreversible. "Ethan," she began, but the rest of her words dissolved, because there was nothing left to ask, nothing left to fix. He had already moved beyond the point where her regret mattered. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Ethan said, and he meant it. Victoria let out a quiet, unsteady breath. "I think I already lost it." Ethan didn't respond, because that wasn't his truth to carry anymore. Behind him, the room continued as if nothing had happened. Laughter, music, glasses clinking. But between them, everything had shifted. Ethan stepped back slightly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough. A boundary, clear, unmistakable. "Take care, Victoria." And just like that, he turned. No hesitation, no second glance. Victoria stood there unmoving, watching him walk away, not because he was leaving, but because he already had, a long time ago. Across the room, Isabella met him halfway. No questions, no need. Ethan took her hand, and for a moment, the world felt quiet again. Behind them, Victoria remained where she was, surrounded by everything she had chosen, everything she had gained. And for the first time, she felt the full weight of what it had cost her. Not in loss, but in absence. The city didn't pause for endings. It never did. New York moved the same way it always had. Restless, indifferent, alive, with a rhythm that refused to acknowledge personal collapse. Taxis cut through intersections, lights flickered across glass towers, and somewhere in rooms filled with laughter and champagne, people celebrated things that wouldn't last. And yet, for some, everything had already ended. Victoria Hale stood alone in the middle of her penthouse living room, the silence pressing in from all sides. The space was immaculate, every detail curated, every object placed with intention. It was everything she had once believed success should look like. And now, it felt like a display, not a life. Julian wasn't home. He rarely was anymore. Meetings, travel, late nights that no longer required explanation. At first, she had admired that about him, his focus, his control, the way he never seemed to drift. Now, it felt like distance. Cold, calculated, permanent. Victoria walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection following her like someone she didn't quite recognize. She thought about the gala, about Ethan, about the way he had looked at her, not with anger, not with longing, but with something far more final: absence. "I don't question it." The words echoed, sharp, clean, unforgiving. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, because that was the moment everything had shifted. Not when she left him, not when she married Julian, but when she realized Ethan had truly let her go. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her. She didn't turn immediately. It buzzed again, persistent, familiar. Finally, she walked over and picked it up. A message from Julian. "Running late. Don't wait up." Victoria stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it, set it down. No follow-up, no explanation, no apology. It wasn't new, but tonight it felt different, because now she could see it clearly. Everything she had once mistaken for strength was control. Everything she had once believed was certainty, was distance, and everything she had traded away was real. Victoria sank slowly onto the couch, her gaze drifting across the room. She tried to remember the last time she had felt grounded, not admired, not validated, but understood. Her mind didn't go to Julian. It went somewhere else, somewhere quieter, softer, more honest. Ethan. Not the man from the gala, but the one from before. The one who listened without interruption, who stayed even when things were difficult, who didn't need the world to see him in order to feel certain of who he was. A sharp breath caught in her throat, because now she understood the difference. And understanding it didn't change anything. It only made it hurt more. Across the city, Ethan stood by the window of a high-rise apartment. Not his old one, not a place filled with memory, but something new, temporary, intentional, free of attachment. Behind him, Isabella moved quietly through the space, her presence steady, unforced. She didn't ask about the gala, didn't ask about Victoria. She didn't need to. Ethan turned slightly, watching her for a moment. There was no tension in his chest, no lingering weight, no unfinished thought pulling him backward, just stillness. "You're quiet," Isabella said, glancing at him. Ethan nodded once. "It's over." She studied him not for confirmation, but for truth, and she asked. Ethan looked out at the city, at the place that had once defined him, broken him, reshaped him, and nothing he said, because that was the truth. There was no dramatic release, no overwhelming sense of victory, no need for closure, just absence. And for the first time, that absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. Isabella walked over, stopping beside him. Close enough to be felt, not so close that it needed to be defined. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. Ethan turned to her, and this time there was no hesitation. Yes, because whatever he had once been, whatever he had once lost, it no longer belonged to him. And more importantly, he no longer belonged to it. Ethan reached for her hand, not out of need, not out of fear, but out of choice. And Isabella didn't hold on tightly. She simply held on. That was enough. Days later, the city moved on, as it always did. Victoria appeared at events, still elegant, still composed, still admired. But something had changed. Subtle, invisible to most. She spoke less, laughed less, paused more often than she used to. And sometimes, when no one was looking, she drifted. Just for a second. Because no matter how much she gained, there was something she could no longer reclaim. Not Ethan, but the version of herself who had once known what mattered. And that was the real loss. Weeks later, Ethan left New York again. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just quietly. Because he had taken what he needed from the city. Not revenge, not validation, clarity. And that was enough. On the morning of his departure, he stood at the airport, beside Isabella, watching planes rise into a pale sky. "Where to next?" she asked. Ethan considered the question, then smiled faintly. somewhere new, not to escape, not to disappear, but to continue. Because the past had already given him everything it could, and for the first time, he wasn't looking back.